Welcome back, everybody. It's a kind of a marathon afternoon, but what wouldn't we do to celebrate women and girls in science? So thanks for still being with us. It's now time for a different session. We'll have 5 speakers who have taken up a special challenge. We will first listen to Michel, who is founder of Pop-Up Yoga Concepts, and he will talk about adopting more conscious lifestyle and way of working. And then we'll have 4 testimonials from passionate scientists. Michel, you now have the floor.
Thank you. Firstly, it is truly an honor to be here at this event. It's a very unique topic. And well, you've already introduced really what I've been doing with my time. But this has really been a very educational journey for me, also in understanding what women have been going through in the field of science. And today, I hope my talk here will help shape a clearer lens on the crucial topic of worthiness. The topic of worthiness, so it's a very broad topic I came to really understand, but it's really made me think of my own self-worth. And when I was really kind of thinking more deeply about it, it clearly, self-worth is a topic that changes, it evolves, and even fluctuated within context over the years. So my humble understanding today is that worthiness is a practice. It's a practice of knowing your worth at your deepest core level. And I think that sounds quite vague. It's like, how do you get there? How do we know our self-worth at our deepest core level? So I thought I would just illustrate with a quote. That's really going to be the running theme of my talk here today. And it's a quote from Wayne Dyer. And he talks about the lens. So when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And that's something I just really want the idea to kind of sit in with the audience here today. When I started first exploring the subject of worthiness, there were a couple of definitions that I found really interesting in formal dictionaries. So if we look at worthiness, the first one was how suitable someone or something is. And funnily enough, the formal example that they gave was she persuaded the board of her worthiness to run the company, which I thought was a really interesting pronoun to use, considering the context we're in here today. And there were some other formal definitions that I found really interesting. So there was the quality of deserving respect or attention, the quality of being good enough, and the quality or state of having value. So when you kind of look at the running thread, the key words were respect, value, being good enough. And I still found the words, they were very heavily loaded, because how do you actually integrate that? How do you integrate those words in your DNA? So I thought, okay, what's going to be an easy exercise for me is to really look at the flip side of worthiness. And I'd like you perhaps now I'd like to ask you, can you remember a time when you felt invisible? And invisible, I mean, probably not heard or not recognized. And I think when I played with the memory for myself to kind of set the tone of the talk today, I thought, okay, well, how does that feeling feel in your body, right? Usually a memory of something like that, it's pretty visceral. And I started to kind of see that it really depended on the context. So the first places were, of course, the workplace, which we've been discussing today, school, at home, past relationships. So it really depended on the context of where I found myself in. And there are two examples for me that I just want to illustrate with. So I can only speak from my humble experience. So when I kind of struggled with being invisible or having a lack of self-worth, it was usually when well, I'm a Eurasian man, I'm gay, born in the 70s. So, you know, being mixed race was pretty a novelty in the 80s. And most people kind of said like, okay, so where do you come from? And why do you speak the way that you do? And these were always these kind of signals that came to me, just kind of made me feel a little bit different. And different here, meaning that I didn't belong, which is kind of a word that has popped up in the conference today. And I also didn't identify with any media messages at the time when I was growing up, coming from where I was. So I didn't feel like, you know, that I belonged in Thailand, which is where I'm from as well, and in Belgium. The second example is from school. This is actually, it happened, this was quite a visceral memory, but I call this a Mr. Klaassen story. This was a Dutch teacher. He had a very big impression on me when I was growing up. And I remember when I was transferred into the Dutch section, having moved just back to Europe, I thought my Dutch was pretty good at the time, but he made it very clear from the very beginning that I didn't belong in the Dutch section, that I would never be good enough to pass the entire curriculum. And I basically believed what he told me at the time. And I was only, I think, 13 at the time, and it literally kind of crushed my self-worth. And as a kid, which we've also highlighted today, we're extremely impressionable. So it was the first time that I could probably signal a sense of shame, you know, and what is shame? It's really identifying with the false negative belief that could be from your environment. So I remember at the time, every time I would go to class, I would really be very sweaty. I mean, you know, to the point that I couldn't answer basic questions in class. And so much so that I was pulled up at the time to tell a very simple fable, and I couldn't. I just couldn't, because I kind of believed that I couldn't do it. And the reason why I'm starting with this story, it's really just to demonstrate that if we believe we are not good enough by our external factors, then it really diminishes our ability to do our work. Now, the reason I'm beginning with these stories is because self-worth is not only a gender issue. I believe that all of us are struggling with a sense of self-worth, and more dangerously, some of us are not even aware of it. And I think, coming from a minority group myself, I can relate to feeling a little bit invisible in a certain context. So I started to ask myself some questions. So, okay, so what is worthiness? It's a mix of components. It depends upon the circumstances we find ourselves in. And then I thought, okay, the questions I really need to ask here is, well, what is my self-worth lens? What has helped shape this lens? How do I see it? And our lens is really our perception, our understanding of our place in the world, which is going to, in turn, shape our experience. So our outcome here being our self-worth. So then I thought, okay, well, is it dependent on the following? Because self-worth is very nuanced. For example, our external factors or experiences determining our self-worth, like I illustrated in my story with my Dutch classes. Or is self-worth linked to identity, societal expectation, or the fitting in? And is self-worth linked to achievement, possession, social status, and even how many degrees we accumulate? And then it started to get me thinking, okay, so the common thing that all of these things have, this drive for trying to build our self-worth, is really the need for belonging, which is a word that has popped up today. But what's even more interesting is that when the need for belonging becomes watched through a shaded lens, it starts to deliver stress, anxiety, depression sometimes for some people, or burnout, or even shame. And shame can come on different levels, you know, but it's really identifying with that false negative belief. So when I started to look up the formal definition and in a bit more detail of worthiness, there are two things. So there's self-esteem and there's self-worth. And both are necessary to define worthiness. So I'll illustrate. So self-esteem is really what you kind of think about yourself. Like you could say, I'm really the best at research in my department. And what it really means, it's like an internal assessment of our qualities, our attributes. It's really identifying with your achievement. So it's really like gathering evidence on what you're like as a person. So it could be like, you know, the kind of job that you have, whether you have a car, you have a house, having kids, being in a marriage. And the tricky thing about this is that it can start to be a trap of false self-esteem because it's based on external evidence, which can become narcissistic. So, and inversely, it can be the other way around. So as my story, I was saying with my identity crisis, it can go the other way. So if we're going to really dig a little bit deeper, self-worth really, which is different from self-esteem, is the value, which is what I said in the dictionary value, on which you place on yourself as an individual, regardless of your traits. So I'll illustrate even further. So for example, if your self-esteem is pretty low and you've accumulated all these wonderful achievements, but you kind of have a tape loop saying, well, you know, I'm not worthy, I'm stupid, I'm lazy, I'm boring. And other people are telling you otherwise, but you don't believe it yourself. So you're actually judging yourself, then your lens is shaded. And it really suggests that self-worth is really the belief. And so I emphasize the word belief, that you are valuable, that you are lovable, regardless of how you evaluate your traits. So I'm not a woman in science, but I can definitely relate to the feeling of not belonging in certain environments. So I can only speak from that viewpoint. But, you know, then I thought, okay, so how did it work for me? Like, how did I kind of shape my lens? Because it still becomes, you know, abstract when we're just throwing big words here. And I have 5 actionable points that have really worked for me. And it's really helped me shape my self-worth lens. And I did it really in a specific order because you can't do step 5 without the first 4. It's literally impossible. So the first one is embodying mindfulness. The second is cultivating a nurturing environment. The third is building an accountability strategy. The fourth is embracing your individuality. And then 5th is setting healthy boundaries. And again, I reiterate, they have to come in a specific order. So the first one, mindfulness, it's a really kind of, it's the pop culture word that everybody kind of throws around right now. But it really is about developing self-awareness to get to the truth. And I call it like the onion experiment for me. So when I started my journey as a yoga and meditation teacher, I didn't actually realize how low my self-worth actually was until I actually sat down on a cushion and started meditating. And I was even hard on myself when meditating because I was angry that I couldn't do it. And I just wonder if anybody here suffers from imposter syndrome. So, you know, this kind of like, you know, I think the higher you go, sometimes the more critical you become of self. And what that makes you realize is that that's actually a mindless pattern of thinking. So just to kind of see what your self-talk is like, if you forget something, do you say, God, I am so dumb for forgetting something? Or do you, it's your self-talk like, okay, that was silly of me to have forgotten that task. And it's a very, very different angle of looking at things, but it's very crucial because what's going on here is daily. So I cultivated a meditation or mindfulness practice now for many years ago. And I don't know if some of you here are familiar with doing any meditation. But of course, the first thing is, okay, it makes you aware of emotions. It makes you aware of reactions. But a big, huge part of it was really how I thought about myself. So really having the tape loop, you know, that like, how are you talking to yourself? And how are you identifying with what you're thinking about yourself with? And it's really about saying, okay, so this is my thinking, this is me, and meditation is really the gap between those two, yeah, so that you don't attach to the identifying beliefs. And that's why I call it the onion experiment, because what meditation does year after year after year, you start to become a lot more honest with how you think about yourself. So you start to evaluate the quality and the truth of your thoughts, of perception of self. So what I'm trying to say here is, A, you need to understand what you're good at. If you're very critical on self, you need to extend a softer approach to say, you know what, I'm okay at this and I'm really good at it. But in equal measure, because nobody's perfect, I mean, nobody can do everything great. You have to extend compassion to the things that you're having difficulty in equal measure. And what's really good about that, when you identify that, you start to discern what you have control over and what you don't. And that is a clear strategy. It's not vague. And after you do that, it started to, you cultivate your internal self-talk. You go to step 2, which is cultivating your environment. So is it nurturing? That's why I began with a story in school. It is suggestive that if your environment, if it doesn't, it can nurture or destroy your worthiness. So if the education, if the workplace do not create a haven for breeding a sense of worthiness by reinforcing messages, signals, actions that elevate someone, then the individual is going to suffer a lack of self-worth, which is going to in turn affect their work. So I kind of started to redefine mentorship for me, and it's really great that we had a mentorship talk, which I found really interesting. For me, I didn't have a platform to seek a mentor as such, but when I started looking at it, I thought, okay, there are 3 areas that are a breeding ground for mentorship, which is first, your friends, B, your family, 3, if you are fortunate to have one, of course, and 3, your work colleagues. So for example, friends, it's again nuance. Are they friends that elevate you, or are they codependent? And what I mean by that is, are they really happy for you when you rise, or are they secretly envious? And the same thing with family. Are they happy? Are they, wait, sorry, are they projecting their own ideas onto you? Or are they elevating your desires? And the third, work colleagues. Are they debilitating your work, or do they support and align with the value of your work? And, you know, these 3 areas, as I said, are a breeding ground for mentorship. It's really about, you know, mentorship, I thought was kind of like somebody's here and I'm down here and I'm kind of, you know, looking up to what they can teach me. But what I've thought a way that has helped me was to see, to really surround yourself with people who see the best in you before you even see it yourself. And some of you, I'm not sure about Simon Sinek, he's a business thought leader, but he says it so well, and quote unquote, he says a great mentor is a friendship. It is non-hierarchal. It is someone who listens, is non-judgmental, and in turn calls you out when you are not on track with your values. So that's really important. It's not about stroking the ego, but it's really about calling you out when you're not on track. Then I went to the third step, which is really building an accountability strategy. So an accountability strategy was just being my own coach. So it helped me build self-trust. And usually self-trust, we fail on that when we have fear. So when you, for example, I don't know if anybody here has made a promise to themselves at the beginning of New Year, you're like, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, you know, become fit by March, you know, do all this stuff. And then it doesn't happen, right? And then what happens is that it makes you, it diminishes your lack of your self-worth. So, and that's usually out of a fear of failing. Yeah? So for me, you know, being an entrepreneur has really been my biggest accountability strategy. And I use daily lists. So it's really like building it with every action, decision, plan, project. And every time it follows through, it helps you build genuine self-trust. And the lens of fear starts to change, because clearly being out of your comfort zone is healthy for your growth. I mean, the perception of fear needs to change. I'm not saying fear doesn't become a part of you, it's how you perceive it. It's very, very, very different through different lenses. Great. So the fourth is then embracing authenticity. And I'm sure you've heard so many posts that say like, be yourself, be authentic. But you don't wake up one day out of bed and say, I'm authentic, I'm real today. It's really an actionable task of speaking up and sharing what you think. And it's very vulnerable. And the lens of vulnerability can be clouded by a fear of being judged, right? That's very, very common. And I do have to quote Brene Brown here, but she does talk about vulnerability, and that's part of authenticity. Is it's really having the courage to speak up. And she says, quote unquote, having difficult conversations. So it's about really using every opportunity when you can to say, okay, I don't agree with this. And I think that's very authentic. It's not about just being yourself. It's about speaking up when it feels very uncomfortable. And then the last one, it brings me to my last point. So setting boundaries. And that's why I say it in the specific order. It is impossible to set boundaries if you don't have the first four. So for me, people pleasing has been a huge problem. I used to think it was really easy to be liked by saying yes to everything or agreeing a lot in meetings with teams, but it's really hard. It's really hard to do that because you carry all of that responsibility on your shoulders. And you cannot set boundaries when you have no awareness, when you have no self-trust, when you have no strong personal value system. And once you have those, then you can say no. You can. It becomes much easier. So this has been huge for me. And this got me thinking, okay, well, how can we bring it in the workplace? You know, and I want to round up my talk here, is that they are these things that I've been talking about. It's, you know, what's important to know is that fear begets fear, as my high story school suggests. So if you don't recognize something as something that is traumatic, or then the cycle just repeats by avoiding it and by judging yourself, which means you start to judge others anyway when you're judging yourself. So if we're really going to look at worthiness at the workplace, you need to have a clear set of value systems. And I would like to say the following. For example, at the workplace, imagine if you had programs for teams that harness self-awareness like mindfulness meditation together, or an environment where we take risks and really have those difficult conversations together, or an environment where there is an accountability strategy even when it goes wrong, men and women together, right? Mentorship programs that are non-hierarchal, and an environment where you can really speak your mind and where listening though is key. Yeah, so listening, more listening than speaking. And I think we truly thrive. So I really want to conclude by asking you a question here today. What is your lens of how you see your worthiness in the world today? Because, you know, I've learned we become what we believe about ourselves, and limiting beliefs can destroy our sense of self-worth, as it did with my experience in school. I think if my lens had been shaded differently in those Dutch classes, I could be thriving in a language I probably never knew possible. But the same goes for women, unnoticed of their value in the workplace. I think worthiness is strongly linked with a need for belonging. That's clearly what I've been trying to say here. But we need a very clear lens for that. So first you need a belonging to self, and then can we create a sense of genuine belonging with others as a collective. So if your environment, like your work culture, would embody the values that elevate your self-worth, we would excel. So it's really time as a collective, I mean, not women only, but men also, to change the way women are perceived at the workplace. And I really truly think it would be a waste if a lack of self-worth got in the way of their purpose, or the purpose of the organization. And this is why I would like to end by just saying, as you can see, when we, so men and women, change the way we look at things, the things we look at will change. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a real honor to speak here.
Thanks a lot, Michel. It's been really inspiring as we announced. It may have looked at the beginning though it was slightly different and slightly out of the scope, but actually it was 100% within what we were trying and what we've been trying to explore the whole afternoon. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I also want